King Von was the devil of Chicago. He grew up in O Block, one of the most infamous and dangerous gang neighborhoods in the country. As a teenager and young adult, he was a ruthless killer, gangbanger, and thief, and this didn't stop when he started rapping in 2018. He's been connected to several murders, and he remained involved in gang violence until 2020, when Von was shot and killed by an associate of a rival rapper. King Von has been called many things: a serial killer, a demon, a devil. But so far, nobody has looked past the surface level. Nobody has tried to determine King Von's class. What class is King Von? To answer this question, we have to go back to the writings of Karl Marx. Marx wrote that the history of society is defined by the struggles between classes due to their opposing interests. These classes have varied throughout history, but under capitalism, the main classes are the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is the working class. To make a living, they depend on selling their labor for a wage. Examples are factory workers, who work to create products in exchange for a wage, and cashiers, who handle transactions in exchange for a wage. But who does the proletariat sell their labor to? The answer is the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are those who own the means of production, aka the machines, tools, and other things that are used to produce goods and services. They are not forced to work in order to make a living. Instead, the bourgeoisie pays the proletariat to use the means of production for them, ultimately generating profit for the bourgeoisie. For example, a factory owner owns the machine that the factory worker uses to create products, and Walmart owns the cash register that cashiers use to process transactions. Additionally, the proletariat does not own what they produce, the bourgeoisie does. A McDonald's employee does not own the burgers they make, McDonald's does, before those burgers are sold to a customer. Notice how these classes aren't defined by income, but instead by their relationship to the means of production. King Von is definitely not part of the proletariat. In his song Lurkin, he says this:
Young nigga, 26, never had a job. They never gave a nigga shit, so I had to rob. I was walking niggas down.
Von also owns his masters and publishing rights, meaning he has the rights to the composition of his songs and has complete control over how the recordings of his songs are used. Von never signed a traditional record deal. Instead, his contract with his record label was project-based. So unlike the proletariat, King Von owned the product of his labor, even if his music was distributed through a record label. Okay, so if he's not part of the proletariat, then he must be part of the bourgeoisie, right? Well, not exactly. Between the primary classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, there's the petite bourgeoisie. The petite bourgeoisie own the means of production just like the bourgeoisie, but unlike them, the petite bourgeoisie are still forced to perform labor to make a living. An example is a shopkeeper. They own the shop and might even have a few employees, but they still must work alongside them to make a living out of it. Artists that survive off of commissions are another example. Their means of production is their art supplies, and they must use these supplies to create art that they can then sell to make a living. Unlike the proletariat, the shopkeeper and the artist own the product of their labor before that product is sold. How does this compare to King Von? Well, in music, the means of production are things like instruments, microphones, and recording studios. Von never owned these in the traditional way. Instead, he pays to have access to them, like paying for an hour of studio time. When he does this, he uses the means of production despite not owning it. There was even the time he recorded his hit song Took Her to the O in some guy's kitchen, where presumably no money was exchanged at all. But even though he doesn't own the means of production in these cases, his relationship to the means of production is fundamentally similar to the petite bourgeoisie's relationship to the means of production, and fundamentally different to the proletariat's relationship to the means of production. Just like the petite bourgeoisie, Von uses the means of production to produce a product that he owns and then sells to make a living. Meanwhile, the proletariat uses the means of production to produce a product that they don't own, and they instead make a living through selling their labor. So although King Von doesn't own the means of production, his relationship to it is nearly identical to the petite bourgeoisie's, so I don't see any reason to exclude him from this category. The next criteria for the petite bourgeoisie is that their living must come primarily from their own labor. King Von meets this criteria, since he actually has to perform his songs himself to make money. This is different from someone like Elon Musk, a member of the bourgeoisie, whose wealth comes from employing thousands of people who work for him. Of course, King Von's labor is not the only labor that goes into his songs. He pays producers to make beats for him, and he pays engineers to mix his songs. What separates Vaughn's songs from, for example, the Tesla cars made by Elon Musk's company, is that his songs are primarily the product of his own labor, while Elon Musk's Teslas are not. King Von makes a living mostly off of his own labor, while Musk makes a living off of the profit that his many employees produce for him. The fact that Vaughn might have employed some producers and engineers doesn't change this, since his songs are still mainly the products of his own labor, and having a small number of employees doesn't exclude him from being part of the petite bourgeoisie. So ultimately, King Von's relationship to the means of production is similar to the petite bourgeoisie's, and he makes a living primarily from his own labor just like the petite bourgeoisie, so it only makes sense to classify him as being part of the petite bourgeoisie. King Von is petit bourgeois, or at least, King Von near the end of his life was petit bourgeois. He started rapping just 2 years before he died, so he was only petit bourgeois for 2 years. What class was he before 2018? As King Von said before,
young nigga, 26, never had a job. They never gave a nigga shit, so I had to rob. I was walking niggas down.
He wasn't part of the proletariat, since he made a living off of stealing and not wage labor. Marx would have considered the younger King Von to be part of the Lumpenproletariat. The Lumpenproletariat is the mass of people that sit outside ordinary society. They have no consistent line of work, and instead live off of the crumbs of society, often resorting to crime in order to make a living. Marx, putting on his best Trump impression, describes the Lumpenproletariat as containing vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, pimps, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, and beggars. And so, while it's not easy to map King Von onto the classes that Marx talked about, it can be done. The younger King Von was certainly part of the Lumpenproletariat, since he made a living off of the crumbs of society and from robbing people. When he started rapping in 2018, his class character became similar to that of the petite bourgeoisie. Although he didn't own the means of production, his relationship to the means of production was most similar to the petite bourgeoisie, and he sold the product of his labor to make a living, just like that class does, so for all intents and purposes, the rapper King Von was petite bourgeois.